Thank you, Brother Danny, for those songs. Appreciate them. I was telling Brother Danny I saw him in his school picture reunion, taken one about 40 years ago. He looked exactly the same as he does now. There was no difference. No, my class, they didn't have a 50 reunion this year, or it was 2 years ago. I don't know why. Okay, would you turn this morning to Deuteronomy, Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. We're going to read this whole chapter together because there's a lot in here. Daniel chapter 3. Starting in verse 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set in the plains of Dura in the province of Babylon. And the king Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrate, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So satraps, administrators, governors, counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. But at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and symphony of all kinds of music, and all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid dues regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when they brought these men before them, Nebuchadnezzar spoke and saying to them, It is true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you do not serve my gods and worship the golden image which I have set up. Now, if you are ready at the time, you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and all in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor shall we worship the gold image which you have set up. And Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Now these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, their other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace was exceedingly hot. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spake to his counselors, Did we not cast in 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. The satraps, administrators, governors, and king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that these men on whose bodies the fire had no power, the hair of their head was not singed, nor their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not survive, nor serve, nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap. And because there is no other God but can deliver this, the king promised Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon. It goes on to tell that the men that had complained against the Chaldeans were thrown into that fiery furnace as well. In the book of Daniel, a great book in the Old Testament, we see the account of God's servant there many times alone, serving these pagan kings like Nebuchadnezzar. It would be the Babylonians, later the Persians. He would serve them. Now, some of the Jews, such as Daniel, had been in captivity since the year 606 BC. There were actually three different groups that went into captivity. And finally, the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 586, and that was the final group that went. Some have said, oh, this is just historical fiction. These are people that are professional doubters, that they make their money off of doubting the Bible and casting aspersions on it. And of course, that's not true. The book of Daniel, or rather Daniel himself, is mentioned in the Old Testament by Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezekiel, and even by Jesus in Matthew and Mark. So he was not just some historical made-up fiction. He was a real human being that went through a lot. Chapter 1, we see where he and his three friends were taken into the King Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and there they were raised and trained to work in his government. And he finally accepted them and renamed them Belteshazzar, that'd be Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and my mother used to say, to bed you go. Abednego. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, we see the great chapter where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of this image, and maybe the same image that he erected, and it had different components to it: a breast and armor, armor, or legs and arms, and things like that. No one could tell him what this dream was or what was in it, except Daniel. And in appreciation, the king gives him and his three friends, Jewish friends, positions in the Babylonian Empire. Daniel would be equivalent to a prime minister of a king back then. So very important to get someone who was not of the same. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was probably a Chaldean. That was one of the tribes over there. Now, let's look at this today, this great account of faith that we see and of God's power that happened so long ago, and see what we can learn from it about ourselves and learn about life itself. One thing we can learn, I have there in the notes, is the setting was inviting to sin. You have Nebuchadnezzar, who was an all-powerful monarch. He was one of the Asian monarchs where you didn't just not walk up to him and talk to him. You bowed down and fell on the ground in front of him. Prostrate yourself on the ground. His word was absolute. Absolute. And his empire stretched all the way from the borders of India to Egypt. He built this image, and it tells in the Bible the cubits. A cubit could be anywhere from, it was distance from your elbow to your forefinger. Well, that could be anywhere from 21 inches to 18 inches, anywhere in between there. So if you figure some of that, it would be about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Now, it says a gold image. It probably was covered with gold, gold leaf or gold plates or something, because That's more gold that was in the world back then, and probably more than the world now. That's a lot, tons and tons of gold. But whatever it was, it may have been, as I mentioned, dreams, it may have been made out of some wood or stone and then covered in gold. Whatever it was, it looked like gold, and it's shone in the sun. Jeremiah 16 verse 20 says, will a man make gods for himself which are not gods? And of course, Nebuchadnezzar had earlier praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Belteshazzar, for what Daniel had done interpreting that dream, and he turns around and builds this image. That's why paganism, any non-Christian religion, is so confusing, because people are so fickle, and they can change their minds and do this, that, and the other, and it's, God does not change, thank goodness. The Bible says that in various places, but men do, and that was the case with Nebuchadnezzar. To me, he kind of reminded me of a very spoiled child. You read about him in the books of Daniel, and then also in 2 Kings. Now, the king had commanded that everyone, all the government officials, were to bow down to this image there at the dedication. That they were to come, number one, and there were probably hundreds, if not thousands of them that were there, and they were to bow down and worship when the music began to play. That's an interesting point. You notice the writer, Daniel, over and over again mentions those instruments of music. That's just the way they express themselves. But also, one thing, little side note there, always when you have idolatry, you'll have mechanical instruments of music. They just go together. To this day, it's like that. And especially back then. And, I think the Holy Spirit was showing us something here. John 4, verse 24 tells Christians we should worship God in spirit and in truth. There is no truth in use of mechanical instruments, music, and worship. And the spirit there means attitude. There is no attitude either, because you're not doing what God says to do. And here, the same way, had all this idolatry and all these things. So when people go on and tell about how wonderful the music is where they attend, the choirs, the organists, and the trombones and everything else, guitars, they say, well, where is that in the New Testament? Where do you find it in the Old Testament? Until the time of David, you found it in pagan temples. That's where you found it. And here it was a good example of that. Now, the penalty of this disobedience was a horrible death. It wasn't just go out and hang somebody. It was burn them up. Burn them up. That's, again, Nebuchadnezzar. He was an absolute ruler. He ruled by fear. Absolute fear. He was a tyrant. Now, in verse 6 it says, and whosoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. I've often wondered this, would I have disobeyed the king? It's one thing to say, I love the Lord, yes, I'll do this, that, and the other, but when it comes down to life or death, many people change their allegiance very quickly. When for example, back centuries later, when the Muslims invaded all that area, many people who had been believed in God, apparently, all of a sudden they became Muslims. Because they were afraid. They might die if they didn't become Muslims. That's sad, but it happened. Now, also the setting today for sin is also inviting as it was back then. Sin seems so imposing and all-powerful. In our country today, it just seems like any type of sin has just taken hold of everything. And what it says is it. If you go against what certain people say about a variety of topics that before wouldn't even been talked about, much less said anything for them, you will be ostracized, if not, penalties put out on you, to shut you up in some way. It's enticing, appealing to the senses, and everyone is doing it. Everyone. Our young people go out and they see They claim everyone is doing it. Well, the thing is, they should not be doing it. That's not everyone. Because, as the old preacher used to say, I believe Brother Keeble, you and God make a majority. And, but there is so much in this world to entice people to get them to, in essence, bow down to Satan. That's really what that's doing when they give into the flesh. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, notice what John says, for all that's in the world, A-L-L, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is the world. Everything. Everything is, now, obviously not everything that's good and righteous, good, but all of the things can be evil, can be used wrongly. Authority figures may encourage it, like Nebuchadnezzar. And all his, who wanted to, in that crowd, who wanted to actually stand up and not bow down? Or if they were sitting, they're probably standing. Who was there? None except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the penalty for disobedience back then as it is now can be severe. Oh, we may not lose our life. We might lose our freedom. We might lose our job. We might lose our friends, family. You go on down the list. All those, and as Brother Danny pointed out so well, in many parts of the world, there are still persecution among Christians. I read a while back, I think I mentioned this before, in India, here about a year ago, a mob of Hindu extremists went through some of our brethren's churches buildings there in, I think it was the southern part of India, and started tearing them up and burning songbooks and probably Bibles, they find them, at least songbooks, and caused all such trouble because that was contrary to what they wanted people to do. Now another point is the pressure to sin is imposing. Here it was, you had this massive golden idol. And all these hundreds, if not thousands of people there, all in unison, bow down. And here you had the king. And he says, bow down. And his word was literally law. You bowed down. And there was those three men that did bow down. 3 men. Their enemies noticed their nonconformists, don't they? Their enemies, the Chaldeans. Chaldeans were a group kind of known, if you read earlier when Daniel first tangled with them, here in Daniel chapter 2 and other places too, they were the astrologers and kind of got into different forms of, trying to foretell the future and stuff. All stuff like that. That's what they were, pagan bunch. But anyway, their enemies notice their contrary. You notice how evil finds comfort in numbers. They find comfort in numbers. Everyone's doing it. We're all doing it. And we look back at this, well, that was thousands of years ago, and things have changed. We're much more sophisticated now. No. Evil can still in numbers. There's a great push in this country now to again legalize abortion on demand, to make that the law of the land. Supreme Court in its wisdom finally backtracked and says, oh no, it's not a right, so-called, to have an abortion on demand. And some are saying, oh, you must do this because the polls show so-and-so. Well, who cares what the polls say in the long run? Righteous exalts a nation and sins a reproach to any people. As Solomon said. I believe that's Solomon. Righteous exalts a nation. And unrighteousness certainly doesn't do that at all. But many people find comfort in that. And Moses said in Exodus 23 verse 2, you shall not follow a crowd to do evil. You shall not follow a crowd to... In my class we were talking about the time about 1900, 1890s United States, where lynching was fairly common. They had a lynching over here in Columbia during that time. And, people go and grab some guy out of jail and take it up and string him up on hanging. Everything. And do more than that, too. And, big crowds of people. Would that make it right? Because everyone said, oh, yeah, we're for that. No, it doesn't. But that's what they did back then. Sinners often despise those who try to do right. often do this. They often despise you. In John chapter 15, verse 18, 19, the Lord warned his disciples and us before he was betrayed. He said, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hates you. Hate will come. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. People will always despise and hate you. And I know here a couple of years ago when some of you I know went down to the, was it city council meeting? I think about the liquor license, wasn't it, city council? And Brother Danny was telling me how that some were just, they were just adamant that anybody dare oppose this. And they'd make, things like that. They would not stand up for it. Those that even thought it was, some that thought it was bad. Sinners often despise those who do right. My question is, where was Daniel? That always comes up. Some think that he was out of town somewhere, it was a big empire visiting somewhere. That's a great possibility. I tend to think that though he was there and didn't bow down, but he was so powerful, his enemies did not think they could reach him, but they could reach those below him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think that was the case. I'm not sure. The Bible doesn't say, but we know that if he had been there, he would not have bowed down like his three friends did. Now, their enemies, the Chaldeans, hated them for who they were. Who they were, followers of the one true God. The one true God. They hated them. God's people will always be hated. Now, people may treat you courteous and stuff like that, but down deep there's that animosity. It's often there. You hear little things people call you a Campbellite or something like a derogatory term, and it's always there. John 17, verse 14, the Lord prayed to God, again, right before he was betrayed, praying for us. He says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. That settles it right there. He was not of the world hated them. Why would he hate us? Why would they hate us, rather? Because we are not of the world too. And we should always be distinct from the world. When Christians become, quote, worldly or more like the world, they dress like the world, they talk like the world, they do things like the world, then they won't be hated. But now, if they do say, no, I'm not going to do that, now that doesn't mean go around like the Amish do and wear black clothes and long beard and everything. No, not that. But just the way you are, you will be hated in some way. The king in his arrogance tried to browbeat them into compliance. Let's read this again in verse 13 through 15. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. I'm sure they were a bit afraid to do that. They knew who he was. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them and says, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? For if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and the symphony of all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you from my hands?" Think of that pure arrogance in that statement, that little speech there. He imagines that he is greater than God. Greater than God. If you read about Nebuchadnezzar, about his history, his father, really his grandfather, started taking over the Babylonians, Babylon and all like that. His father especially, and then he kind of was born into it. And he got involved in, he did different military campaigns. He took Jerusalem and stuff. And finally his father dies and he becomes king. But he was not, but what he says, "And who is the God who would deliver you from my hands?" Equating himself with God. Equating himself with God. His fury and cruelty were well known. Over in 2 Kings chapter 25, where Jerusalem was taken by the Babylonians. And the Jewish king Zedekiah, I believe he was the uncle, or the brother rather, of Josiah, if I remember correctly. He tries to escape with his family and some troops, and he is captured. And it says, in verse 5, and they took the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and this would be Nebuchadnezzar. And they pronounced judgment on him. Then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. He lived for many years there as a prisoner. Can you imagine the last thing you saw was your king, your children, your sons being killed, executed? That was a cruel thing to do. Cruel thing. Reminds me over in Psalm 2, where David wrote this, that is, you read again in the book of Acts, I think it's Acts about 7, or no, it's about 5 or 6 right in there. Why do the nations rage? King James says, why do the heathen rage? And the people plot a vain thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. So none of these things impress God. However cruel men may be, and they can be very cruel, and evil, malicious. There's a lot of different adjectives there. God holds them in derision because he knows what will happen to them. Sin is overwhelmed by obedience to God. In verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Notice that. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Here they answered very respectfully, but firmly. They said, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Our mind is made up. We're not going to change. We're not going to change. They had already made up their minds to obey God, whatever the cost. Friends, it's the duty of every Christian to obey God, whatever the consequences. That may be loss of jobs. It may be loss of family, of friends, whatever it may be. We should be prepared for that. And it's what's the old phrase? A good deed will not go unpunished. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes you pay a price for doing good. And they surely did. They were about to, weren't they? Over in Acts 5, verse 29, when the Jews had told the apostles, do not preach anymore in the name of this man, Jesus Christ. Well, they go ahead and do it. So they bring them back in again and said, why have you done this? We told you not to. And Peter says, and the other apostles, by the way, too, we ought to obey God rather than men. Said respectfully, they weren't trying to be defiant to them or arrogant or anything. He says, we must obey God rather than men. We have to. Romans 6, verse 17, Paul said, but God be thanked that you were slaves of sin, but you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which you delivered. We have to make a stand somewhere. Make a stand when we become a Christian. We obey what God says to do, to believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. He says to do that, and we do it. In essence, we are disobeying Satan to do that. We must realize that sin is overwhelmed by obedience to God. It doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know what to do. Remember when the Lord, they said to the Lord, are you the Son of God? And he said, yes, you have said so. And they were just inflamed at this. They couldn't believe anybody would. What could they do? Nothing but just kill him. That's all they could do. But still, that was the way it was. They showed complete obedience to God. And I love this verse here in verse 17 and 18. it says, if this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us the burning fiery furnace, and will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you set up. If God was able to deliver them from the furnace, God can do it. God can do anything. Psalm 121 verse 7, the Lord shall preserve you from all evil, and he shall preserve your soul. Now, they were firmly committed, and their commitment, their determination was based on what? Their opinion? I have this strong opinion here. No, it was based on God's commandments. We go back to the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 and 5, where God wrote with his finger, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or is in the earth beneath, or is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow to them, down to them, nor serve them. That's pretty clear. They knew this. They'd been probably taught that since childhood. They knew that. Well, what about us? The Lord tells us in John 15, verse 14, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. The Lord has commanded us, for example, to not forsake the assembly together. Hebrews 10, verse 25. And so we meet. We do what the Lord commands. I remember, who was it? Brother G.K. Wallace, I think that was it. He said once, he said, you know, I determined to, it says, I haven't missed but one time since I was baptized so many years before, because I was just determined from the very beginning, say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be there. And he says, I don't think of anything else but being there with the brethren. And that was well before he was preaching. Okay, all this was based, or rather, their determination was not based on whether or not God saved them from the furnace. Oh, God will save us, King. Oh, he'll do it. He'll do it. He'll do it. No, we don't have to worry. He'll do it. No, it says God may not choose to. It's up to God. It's up to God. Job 13, verse 15, Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. It was based on their love and trust in God. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, Paul says, for we walk by faith and not by sight. We do what God says to do. We have that love and that trust, we do it. They were resolved to be faithful to God, whatever happened. Oh Lord, I'll serve you until things get real bad, and then I have to do something else. I have to make a difficult decision. I've heard people say that. Well, what does it say here? 2 Timothy 2, verse 12, 13. Paul says, if we endure, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. So there, the Christian should be resolved to be faithful whatever happens. You know, we may, this building may blow away in a tornado someday, or be burned down, or whatever it may happen, but we will still serve God. I sometimes wonder, some brethren, if their building did get wiped away, what would happen to them? They would just kind of give up, as Brother Danny was saying. The preacher moves, or the elders resign, and they just fall apart. That's not what God intended. That's the wrong concept of the church, too. What do you think about it? Psalm 118, verse 6, David wrote again, the Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do to me? Men can kill the body, as I believe John the Baptist said, but they can't kill the soul. I think that was Jesus' word too. They can kill this body, but they can kill what's more important. Their minds were set not to worship idols. Notice verse 18. We do not serve your gods. we do not serve your gods. They were resolved to be faithful to God, whatever happened. Again, 2 Timothy 2, verse 12 and 13. He remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. They expected to die for their public stance. You know, it says, if you destroy us, God will still be with us. We still believe in him. We will not bow down. Again, over in Romans chapter 8, verse 35 and 37, Paul says these wonderful words, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, or persecution, or famine, or weakness, or peril of the sword? Notice he doesn't say, oh, who will separate us from God's help? He'll help us in those times. He'll get us out of the sword, the tribulation. No. Who will separate us from the love of God? As it is written, for your sake we were killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. They were rewarded for their faithfulness. They paid the price for their disobedience to men, as you often do, folks. People are very, very angry, can get very angry and vengeful and hateful and everything else when you don't do what they want you to do. Sinful men are often angry when Christians refuse to conform to their wishes. Proverbs 29, verse 10, the bloodthirsty hate the blameless, but the upright seek his well-being. I think about those Old Testament faithful there in Hebrews chapter 11. And one of the first things the writer mentions there is those that quenched the violence of fire. He may have been talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know. They quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of the weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. God in his mercy miraculously saved them from the fire and death. This is a wonderful thing here, where here you had this pagan, Nebuchadnezzar, and all his other people that were pagans too, of course, and the Chaldeans that complained about everything. And there they see the men in the Bible purposely mentions all their clothes they were wearing. Well, you know what happens? You throw into a fire, your clothes are going to catch on fire real quick. And mentions all their turban, their trousers, and everything. Thrown right in there, and nothing happens. And the men that threw them died from the heat. The men that threw them in there. And Nebuchadnezzar was amazed when he saw 4 men in there. He said, look, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Some versions say, son of a God, little g there. That may be what he's talking about, I'm not sure. He had very little knowledge of the Lord God Almighty. I don't think that in that case, but whatever it was, who was there? I don't know. Some call it a theophany. It means where God's represented Christ and is the angel of the Lord. We talk about this in Bible class, things like that. I don't know, but it was something that impressed everybody, especially Nebuchadnezzar. So here he calls them to come out, and they came out and they were undamaged. He says in verse 27, the satraps, that was like the governors, administrators, governors, and king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. That amazes me, that last part. Because when you have a fire, if you've been around, you've had a fireplace in your house, something like that, you'll get that smell of smoke in your clothes sometime. Just a little bit of it. None of that. None of that. Evil men are often amazed when Christians endure persecution. Don't you know people were amazed by the Apostle Paul, all he went through. They were amazed when Stephen was stoned to death. And yet his last words were, Father, forgive them. And of course Jesus on the cross said the same thing. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 10, therefore Paul says, I take pleasure in infirmities, and approaches, and needs, and persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, I am strong. Then I am strong. Their faithfulness caused their enemies to glorify God. And this is an amazing thing here. When Nebuchadnezzar said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel. He thought it might have been an angel. What he meant by that, I'm not sure. He thought he sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word, that yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Now that's an amazing thought by this arrogant pagan. He wouldn't stick with that very long, as we'll see. But anyway, he still, at that moment, he thought that. Now let's look at a little modern application. We can apply this many ways. The Christian self, do we stand up for the Lord at work? And I came across this several years ago, worked for a chemical company in a laboratory, but there were a lot of salesmen they had, and they were required to take their clients, usually work for some big company, to the lounges, the bars, and kind of soften them up so they would, agree to buy things from them. Could you say, no, I'm not going to do that? I knew a fellow that did that. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. But that was rare. Say your employee asks you to do something unethical in your job. You risk your job, you say no. God will supply another job if needed. You might be ridiculed, cursed, overlooked. But remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I should remember those three, and when I encounter such situations, I should remember God's commandments regarding evil. Stand on those commandments and obey it. I should be resolved to obey God whatever the cost. And with dignity and meekness refuse to conform to the world. By obeying God and not man, I will gain the respect of some, and more importantly, the respect of God. Hebrews 12, verse 2, where the writer says, looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, sat down at the right hand of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your soul, and you have not resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. Brethren, we should never give up. Always strive to do what's right. It may cost us something, but the eternity will be worth it. There may be some here this morning, I don't believe there's any that are not Christians. Those on the internet, though, the Bible tells us to obey God. You must become a faithful Christian. You must believe that Jesus Christ is Son of God, John 8, verse 24. Repent of your sins, Acts 17, verse 30. You must confess him before men, Romans 10, verse 9 and 10. And be born again, baptized for the remission of your sins, Acts 2, verse 38. Remain faithful unto death, Revelation 2, verse 10. Maybe you're a Christian, and you have not been faithful like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe you brought reproach upon Christ and the church by conforming to this world. You need to get it right with God now. Ask forgiveness. In that case, if it was public, you need to come before your brethren and ask their forgiveness as well as God's forgiveness. If this is your need this morning, please come as we stand and sing.
Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to Thee. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of Thy love. Take my will and make it Thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is Thine own. It shall be Thy royal throne. Lord, I give my life to Thee, Thine forevermore to be. Lord, I give my life to Thee, Thine forevermore to be. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at Thy feet. myself, and I will be ever only all for Thee. Lord, I give my life to Thee, Thine forever more to be. Lord, I give my life to Thee, Thine forever more to be. Please be seated. Number 4, the Lord's Supper, scene number 633, 633. The first, second, and last verse, please. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and for contempt all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to His blood. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my